So I'm gonna do another tutorial on Multimattes. The free ways I create Multimattes in 3ds Max, which is rendering 101 basically, and it's what your compositors are gonna use to isolate parts of your 2D renders. And I'm going to show you how I go about creating those. So I've got this super simple scene here, and if I wanted to make a multimatte for this, so basically a multimatte, I'll explain what it is first, is if I was to render this, you can see that this is when you render it, it's going to turn into a 2D image, and say when I pass this off to my compositor, he wanted to isolate any parts of these pieces of mesh in 2D, so he could do whatever he wanted with them, whether he wanted to color correct them, blur them, whatever he wanted to do with them. The multimattes are used to allow him to isolate parts of these meshes. And if you work somewhere like I do, where you have a direct line to your compositor and he's messaging you saying what he wants, this is something I do on a daily basis, and it's something I think most of you will probably have to do if you work in Max. You should communicate with the compositor. So I'm going to go over how I would create something like this. So it all starts in the render elements, and firstly this is blank. I've added these free passes because these are the free ways I'll show you how to go about creating these multimattes. The first and most obvious is the multimatte. I've renamed it Multimatte A, but if you want to find it, it's at the very top. It's called Multimatte Element, so you would just hit OK and it would drop down there. You can delete them there. And basically when you add this element, what it's going to do is it's going to add this little dialog box here, and it's going to have a number, and these numbers translate to solid red, green and blue colors, which are the colors that are going to be strong enough for your compositors to isolate these 3D objects in a 2D render. So if I wanted, say I wanted this to be red, I wanted this to be green, and I wanted this to be blue, I would have to give this object an ID that matched this ID here. So if I wanted this to be blue, I'd have to give this an object ID of free, and to add an object ID to a piece of geometry, you right click on the object, you go to object properties, and you're going to have all this information, but more importantly you're going to have this object ID box. If I switch this to free, this now corresponds to this, and if I do a quick render, when I switch to my multimatte, yeah, you're going to see that this is now blue. I thought it didn't work for a second then, I wasn't paying attention. Okay, so that is now a solid blue. You can see it's a very chunky solid blue. It's not like a shallow, like sky blue. It's a solid blue, and your compositor is going to be able to isolate this color pretty easily. And I'll show you why this is important if I go ahead and add object IDs to these other two. So I've given this an object ID of 2, which corresponds to this 2. I give this an object ID of 1. I'm going to add another multimatte element, and I'll explain why in a second. Call that multimatte B. I'm going to give this a number of 4. Say 4, 5, 6. Okay, So I'll explain what I just did in a second there. But if I was to render this again, right now, it's going to build the light cache. I probably should have turned GI off for this, to be honest. But here we go. So it's rendering, and if I was to switch to my Multimatte A, you can now see that they have the corresponding colors. And it's important, the multimattes are really important for this kind of thing when it comes to your compositor needing to isolate things that might be in front or behind, so they might need to color correct this up, and there's stuff in front of it, and instead of having to roto or anything like that, they can just use these multimattes really easily to just isolate this, even with motion blur. It's going to be very easy for them to isolate these objects. And these are the only three colors that the multimattes will come in: red, green, and blue, solid colors. And you'll notice in that render that I added a multimatte for the floor, and it's got an ID of 4, and you can be able to find that in Multimatte B. And you're going to notice that this one is also red, and that is because the multimatte element only comes in those three colors, and it's because, from my understanding, those three colors are the easiest to isolate in 2D compositing software. You can add as many multimatte elements as you want, but you can only have 3 elements per pass. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. If I wanted to add more, you'd have to go ahead and add another multimatte, which I did, called that Multimatte B, and then this is a 4, which is why it came out red. And you're going to have to make sure that they each have their own numbers. If I had extra objects in this space, then they'd have to have an ID of 5 or an ID of 6. Or they can have custom IDs. For example, these all come in as 1, 2, 3 usually. So if I added Multimatte B and these still had 2 and 3, they would render with the second and third multimattes in this pass as well, which is not particularly ideal. So if you want a multimatte with nothing in it, you just want to give it a number that corresponds to nothing, basically. If that makes sense. Say you only wanted this 4th one, you would just assign an ID of 5 and 6, and only 4 would render because there's nothing else here with an object ID of 5 or 6. And there are 2 other ways I use. I can make multimattes in a way. There's another interesting pass, which is called V-Ray Render ID, and if I click on it, it assigns everything a random color in the render. It's something you can just add. It's render ID. It's here, just in the random elements, and when you add that, it's just going to assign a random color to every single object in your scene. And although they're not solid reds and blues and greens, they can be used to isolate things within reason, as far as I understand. I've used this. I usually add this to my list of render passes anyway, before I send it off to comp, and let them know that it's there, and if they want to use it, they can use it. If they don't, they don't. I mean, I'll usually have a huge number of multimattes, so that they can do basically anything they want, but this is more of a safety pass. So the render ID is another one, and finally there is the V-Ray wire color, and that is at the very bottom, V-Ray wire color, and I'll show you how that works. Basically, if you wanted more control over what was getting matted, you can add a V-Ray wire color, and then that is going to correspond to, if I turn edged faces on, it's going to correspond to the color that the wireframe is on, and you can change that pretty simply in 3ds Max by just going up here to this little box and choosing whatever color you want. You can also you can choose from any of these. You can also click on this, and it's going to bring up the color palette. And But say I wanted to use this as a multimatte, you could technically do that by making this like a solid red. And if I was to go ahead, you can see it's changed now. If I made this a green, just a solid green color, and this one like a blue maybe. These now have those colors, so if I was to hit render, obviously these have no materials on them, so they're just going off the wire color. If they had standard figure eight materials on, they'd render out grey, but they don't. But more importantly, if I was to go into this wire color now, you can see that these are now red, green and blue based on the wire color. And these could also be used as multimattes because solid red, solid green, solid blue. Very easy to isolate in a 2D software. This one not so much because obviously I didn't change it. But you get the point of how that would be used. But the main ones, obviously these multimattes. Yeah, it's super handy, and I use these every single day when I'm working because the compositors will always need them, and they're going to be the ones generally telling you what they need in terms of multimattes. So you might create your scene and then send them the first set of passes, and they might come back to you and say, hey, can you make this sphere here red as well? And I would just be able to go here, check what's ID is red, which is 1, and then make that 1, and then it would just be a simple case of making sure this works. So you can see these both share an object ID of 1. So if that's what my compositor wanted, he just wanted 2 IDs of 1, and he was going to use these for something, then I would send those back to him like this. Like I said, I use this nearly every day at work. It's rendering 101. This is how you give comp specific stuff that they might need for the shot to be finished. And these are the 3 ways that I go about doing it. So that is how I create multimattes for 3ds Max.